In the fourth episode, Judas, John, and the other disciples continue to grapple with the repercussions of the actions and teachings that Jesus performed in the temple. Meanwhile, Mary Magdalene and Yosef search for a strategy to thwart the efforts of the Pharisees to destroy Jesus. At the same time, Atticus takes note of Caphne's hostility to Jesus, and Caiaphas, who is dissatisfied with the Pharisees, makes the decision to take matters into his own hands. A cold opening for the Last Supper. The opening scenes of the Last Supper have, up until this point, been taken virtually directly from either the Upper Room Discourse, John 13:17, or the story of the Last Supper found in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew 26 verses 17 to 34, Mark 14 verses 12 to 25, Luke 22 verses 7 to 38. However, near the beginning of the fourth episode of the fifth season, we switch between the women in Bethany and Jesus and the disciples as they sing a rendition of the Dainu, which is a traditional Passover call and response song that tells the account of the Exodus. On the other hand, if he had led us out of Egypt without passing judgment on our enemies, that would have been sufficient. It would have been sufficient if he had pronounced judgments against our foes and had not destroyed their idols. They would have been destroyed. In the event that he had demolished their gods and not given us their wealth, it would have been sufficient and sufficient. In the event that he had provided us with their wealth and had not divided the sea for us, it would have been sufficient. In the event that he had divided the sea for us and not led us over it on dry land, it would have been sufficient. In the event that he had guided us through it on dry land and not drowned our adversaries, it would have been sufficiently sufficient. In the event that he had submerged our adversaries and failed to meet our requirements in the desert for a period of 40 years, it would have been sufficient. In the event that he had submerged our adversaries and failed to meet our requirements in the desert for a period of 40 years, it would have been sufficient. In the event that he had met our need in the desert but had not made the Torah available to us, it would have been sufficient. It would have been sufficient if he had only provided us with the Torah and not brought us into the land of Israel. It would have been sufficient if he had brought us into the land of Israel, but had not constructed the temple for us while we were there. Traditionally, this is the point at which the Dainu comes to an end. However, Big James, who is crying, adds a new verse to the end of the Dainu. He says, if he had only built the holy temple and not sent the Messiah in our lifetime, it would have been enough. We would have waited, but you chose us, and it is enough. Matthew is perplexed by these words, but the other members of the group comprehend them. Following the continuation of the liturgy for Passover, Peter brings out the bitter herbs that remind Israel of their time, spent as slaves in Egypt, as well as the salt water that reminds them of the tears shed by the Israelites. The disciples then pray to God to purify them so that they might fulfill his rules. As the lunch continues, John approaches Jesus in a low voice and inquires in a whisper whether Thomas is going to be the one who betrays the group. Jesus responds in a whisper, most likely advising him that the person to whom he gives the piece of bread after he has dipped it is the one who is intended to receive it. According to John 13 verses 23 to 26, Jesus then dips the bread and hands it to Judas, all the while John and Peter watch with a suspicious expression on their faces. While he is leaning over to Judas, Jesus informs him that he does not need to remain because he has him now. As Judas inquires about the identity of the person to whom Jesus is referring, Jesus simply responds, "Not God." This is an indication that Satan has now entered Judas. See John 13 verse 27. Jesus encourages Judas to hurry up and do what he is about to do, despite Judas's insistence that they still have the ability to prevent things from ending in a negative manner. Andrew assumes that Judas is going to bring alms to the needy and get more food when he gets up and leaves. John 13 verses 27 to 30. Matthew is curious about where Judas is going to go when he leaves. With Judas gone, Jesus explains that because he will only be with them for a short while longer, he has a new order to offer that will transform them. That the disciples love each other as much as he has loved them. John 13 verses 33 to 4. Peter is prompted to wonder where Jesus is going as a result of this, rewinding to the beginning of episode 3. Episode 4 of the 5th season of The Chosen features Atticus, Pilate, and Caiaphas. At the beginning of the 4th episode, Atticus is observing Caiaphas as he continues to stir up the masses by pointing out that Jesus has both shut down the market and supported Rome's taxation. In the 3rd episode, he made a commitment to the seller that he would do justice to. Episode 4 of the 5th season of The Chosen features Yusuf and Mary. Veronica and Jesse are having a conversation about how the religious leaders were attempting to deceive Jesus into saying the incorrect thing. Yusuf is also present in the vicinity and overhears their conversation. Despite the fact that they believe Jesus evaded the traps, they are aware that the statements he made outraged the religious authorities as well as some of the individuals who were there in the crowd. During this time, Mary is searching the streets of Jerusalem for Yusuf, and she comes across Shmuel. In response to her request for assistance in locating his buddy, Shmuel refuses to refer to Yusuf as a friend because of his failure to stand up to Jesus. Additionally, he denigrates Mary by claiming that she is a demon-possessed woman from the Red Quarter. Mary's response is that she is actually from Magdala by the sea, and that she is solely possessed by her Creator. She says this with complete assurance. He will soon wish he was living in a leper colony, according to Shmuel, who is adamant that the recent words said by Jesus were a death sentence. While Mary acknowledges that if Jesus were to be present in a leper colony, he would heal it, she also expresses her sympathy for Shmuel and how the words of Jesus must be extremely distressing for him, especially considering that unlike the other people, he is aware that they are accurate. Shmuel reprimands Yusuf for going with a woman from the Red Quarter during the time that Yusuf is in the presence of them. Despite the fact that Yusuf reprimands him for his impolite behavior, Shmuel responds by reprimanding Yusuf for maintaining his presence at Lazarus' home. Mary requests a moment of silence since she and Shmuel are both concerned about the consequences of what is taking place. Yusuf is also called to an urgent emergency meeting, but Mary asks for a moment of silence. There will be no clarity regarding what she asks Yusuf until the 5th episode. At a later time, during the gathering of the Sanhedrin, Shimon, who is a member of the Hillel family, urges Zebediah and the members of the Shammai family to establish a common cause against Jesus. He does this because Jesus acts outside of their jurisdiction and teaches things that are contrary to tradition and their interpretation of the Torah. As Shmuel stands to testify, he asserts that he is the individual who has documented Jesus' acts for the longest period of time. Yusuf, however, protests by stating that he has witnessed Jesus' deeds for the same amount of time, despite the fact that he has not written his observations, as Shmuel points out. Shmuel becomes so enraged that he encourages them to put Lazarus to death for blasphemy against the Lord, Leviticus 24 verse 16. This occurs when the two individuals discuss whether or not the resurrection of Lazarus was a genuine event or a fake. In light of the fact that Lazarus is a Jew who is in good standing, even Zebediah considers this proposition to be excessive. During the time that Yusuf is attempting to defend Lazarus and Jesus, Shmuel reprimands him for being captivated by the notion that Jesus possesses divine abilities. He then dares the Sanhedrin to vote on whether they believe in the Nazarene or the Scriptures. Upon Mary's return to Phoebe's residence, she discovers Tamar and Joanna engaged in a conversation about Passover and their desire to acquire additional knowledge. They are informed by Mary, with a sense of regret, that they, too, are going to be transported to Bethany, where they will be with Mother Mary, Martha, and Mary of Bethany throughout the Passover Seder. In Bethany, Jesus hosts a special lunch for all of his female disciples after they had gathered together. As he goes around the table, he expresses his gratitude to each of them for the ways in which they have helped him along the way. He expresses his gratitude to Mary Magdalene for holding a Shabbat, even though she felt unworthy and unprepared, to Mother Mary for enduring the pain of Lazarus' death and forgiving him when he stayed in the temple when he was 12 years old, to Mary and Martha for bearing the pain of Lazarus' death and believing that he had a purpose, to Eden for putting up with the sacrifices of Peter's ministry, to Tamar, as a stranger in a foreign land, tolerated slander and displayed beautiful faith and to Joanna for assisting Andrew in meeting John in prison and supporting his ministry. In conclusion, he requests that they maintain a certain distance from him over the course of the next few days and over the Passover holiday, which is when he will deliver some very significant words to the apostles. Mary Magdalene is aware of what has been going on since she has been listening, despite the fact that the others are perplexed as to why this is occurring. Upon hearing this, the women respond by reciting a revised version of the Dainu, which is based on their encounters with Jesus. Mother Mary, if only I had been able to experience the delight of having you in my arms, and if for some reason you had not performed miracles and signs, then that would have been sufficient. In the words of Mary Magdalene, if you had only performed signs and wonders and not called me by name, it would have been sufficient. In the event that you had merely cured Mary of her demons and refrained from calling my husband, there would have been sufficient relief. Tamar, if you had merely called Simon Peter and not healed my friend, that would have been sufficient, as it would have been enough. Martha, if only you had managed to heal Ethan rather than raising my brother, it would have been sufficient. In the case of Mary of Bethany, if you had merely been responsible for the upbringing of my brother and not defended my dignity when I worshipped you, that would have been sufficient. Joanna, if you had merely defended Mary, but not given meaning to my life, which had been so unfulfilled, by allowing me to support you and this miraculous family that I feel will transform the world from the inside out, then that would have been sufficient. Mary Magdalene, on the other hand, departs from the house after the supper, and Tamar follows closely behind. Mary explains to Tamar that Jesus instructed her to keep their distance from him, not Jerusalem, and then she returns to Jerusalem on a mission. Tamar is concerned that she could ignore Jesus' advice about keeping their distance. Episode 4 of the 5th season of The Chosen features Judas, John, and Jesus. Immediately following Peter's return from his conversation with Jesus, Judas inquires as to whether Jesus provided any additional explanations regarding his validation of taxes to Rome. When Peter points out that Jesus couldn't oppose taxation with Roman troops waiting at hand, Judas claims that the one who walked on water and raised Lazarus might have snapped his fingers and had swords appear in the hands of everyone in the temple to protect him. However, Peter retorts that Jesus was attempting to avoid being captured, much like David tried to escape Saul. He is rebuked by him for the fact that Judas asserts that he believes in Jesus, but does not trust that he is aware of what he is doing. As a response, Judas claims that Jesus chose him for a specific reason, and that perhaps it is his responsibility to push him to his limits. On the other hand, Peter tells Judas that this is his own notion and warns him that if he is overly preoccupied with his own beliefs, he will be unable to believe anything else. After some time has passed, Jesus discovers John at Phoebe's home, where he is examining frescoes, and he asks John to retell the Greek stories. John makes the observation that the story that is being depicted appears to be a copy of the story of Jephthah's rash vow that led him to sacrifice his daughter, Judges 11. This is a sacrifice that Jesus insists his father never asked for, but that only occurred because the people were doing what seemed right in their own eyes, Judges 21 verse 25. Following this, John continues to tell the story of how Agamemnon offered his daughter Iphigenia as a sacrifice to Artemis in order to ensure that the journey to Troy would be accompanied by favorable winds. However, Agamemnon was ultimately murdered by his wife, who was then murdered by their son. The son was then haunted by the Furies for the rest of his life and was unable to forgive himself for what he had done. John is aware of the fact that the religious leaders and the disciples are acting in a manner that appears to be appropriate to them, but they are unaware of the consequences of their actions. He wonders how they will be able to find acceptance or forgiveness for themselves. Jesus promises John that he has forgiven them and that his Spirit will never leave them or abandon them. He also urges John to remain close to him and provides him with this assurance. When Judas arrives to talk to Jesus about the closing window of chance to unite the Jewish people and overcome the lies of their foes, Jesus is still in the garden atrium. Judas is there to explain that the window of opportunity is closing. Drawing on his experience in the business world, he maintains that they're facing a precarious situation, one in which they have the opportunity to either seal the deal or lose it. When Judas maintains that it is time for Jesus to recover his birthright as the son of David, Jesus questions whether Judas will continue to believe in him if he does not behave in the manner that he desires. Judas asserts once more that Jesus must have selected him in order for him to make a contribution to his kingdom. Otherwise, he would be nothing. The situation is reversed when Jesus informs Judas that he is on the verge of a decision that will require him to choose between two people who hold his heart. Jesus promises to pray for Judas when Judas says that he wants to continue following Jesus. Judas is pleased with this news. Judas expresses his dissatisfaction with the outcome of the encounter by expressing his gratitude to Jesus for his time and then departing to pray and cry. Instead of staying in Jerusalem, Jesus gives the disciples the order to accompany him and the ladies back to Bethany. This causes Judas to feel frustrated. In the midst of the opportunity to fulfill the prophecies about the Messiah, Judas wonders why the other disciples are standing by drunkenly while the opportunity passes them by, but no one engages with him. Jesus approaches a fig tree, but he is dissatisfied when he discovers that it does not contain any fruit. He is hungry and has no food. His followers are taken aback when Jesus pronounces a curse on the tree, and they proceed to Bethany. Mark 11 verses 12 to 14. When he arrived, he gave orders to his disciples to remain vigilant and asked Z to post guards. He was aware of the potential threat that his presence could represent to Lazarus and the women by virtue of his presence. While the women are having dinner with Jesus that evening, John is standing close to the window and listening with apprehension to the solemn words that Jesus bestows upon them. Caiaphas in the 4th episode of the 5th season of The Chosen. During the time that Gedera is reporting to Caiaphas how Jesus silenced the religious leaders by responding to their question with a question, the high priest sneers at the more narrow-minded Pharisees for their inability to respond appropriately to such an old strategy. He is concerned about the threat that is being made against the temple, despite the fact that he disapproves of Jesus because of his belief in the resurrection. Gedera, however, is skeptical that this will be the primary preoccupation of the Sanhedrin. Rather, they are more concerned with destroying the power that Jesus possesses, particularly among the people. Despite the fact that Caiaphas considers their attempts to capture Jesus to be a waste of time, he is adamant that he can still save the day by having Jesus arrested in a stealthy manner in the night before Passover. In the midst of putting on his priestly ephod, he gives Gedera the directive to devise a strategy for locating Jesus. In the midst of the Sanhedrin's ongoing discussion on what should be done with Jesus, Yanni and Zebediah leave the gathering in order to meet with Caiaphas, who desires to take charge of the gathering himself. According to them, his presence will affect votes, and voters will want to compliment him because of it. At the same time, they admire Annas, Caiaphas' predecessor and father-in-law, for unwaveringly adhering to his beliefs without showing any fear, even when doing so meant being deprived of his mantle in an unfair manner. They ask him out loud why Anna's children, who were equally qualified, were not selected to replace him, and they urge him to seek the opinion of his brother-in-law so that they might have a better case. This is done in an effort to get under his skin. Caiaphas is not amused and mocks Yanni for being a man with little power, but many connections instead of being amused by his situation. On the other hand, he grudgingly consents to have his brother-in-law Ananus provide his opinion on the matter. A review of the 4th episode of the 5th season of The Chosen. Episode 4 possesses a number of really distinctive strengths that are worthy of being noticed. Several intriguing design patterns are shown in Episode 4, which is devoted to design patterns. On either side of the episode, a different rendition of the Dainu serves as a chapter bookend. The fact that the scenes from the Last Supper appear to be taking place in the opposite sequence is another thing that this episode brings to our attention. As far as I can tell, the 5th season is organized in a manner that is reminiscent of the famous film directed by Christopher Nolan, Memento. The cold opening scenes are shown in the opposite order, while the main tale is presented in the chronological sequence. In Episode 8, it is likely that the reverse sequences and the chronological sequences will bring their respective sequences together. Additionally, We are given the first half of the story about the fig tree, as well as the conclusion of the first half of Season 5. The second half of the same story is presented to us during the second half of the new season. It is also extremely appropriate that we witness Judas' last displeasure with Jesus at the conclusion of the first half of the season. This is done so that Judas' turn to the religious leaders can take up the second half of the season. Within the realms of poetry, tradition, and narrative, I am a huge fan of the Danu. The poem is stunning, and it places the events transpiring at the Last Supper within the context of the Jewish custom of Passover. In addition, the fact that James contributes to it is an excellent method of demonstrating how Jesus fits the plot of the Old Testament. Additionally, the placement of the Danu before the New Commandment serves to emphasize the fact that the gracious deeds of God come before His law. Additionally, I adore the way in which the women used the framework of the poem and used it to tell the story of how Jesus offered each of them personal relief. It is a magnificent concept, and I hope that it will encourage a great number of groups and Christians to come up with their own particular Danu prayers. I have every intention of including this discipline into the Bible study and discussion guide that I have prepared for the episode. In addition, I am grateful for the connections to the tragic stories of Jephthah and Iphigenia, which establish interesting similarities between the deeds of Judas and those of the religious authorities. The fourth episode of The Chosen lore draws a great deal more on previous events from The Chosen in a manner that I believe a great number of fans will find to be both nostalgic and rewarding. The most apparent example is the Danu that is performed by the women, but I also really enjoy how Shmuel makes references to Mary's history, as well as how he and Yosef discuss their own history with Jesus. The amount of time spent on public speeches in episode 3 gave the impression that it was somewhat abstract and impersonal. However, episode 4 provides us with a greater number of character-based exchanges. These exchanges take place in public spaces, such as Shmuel's remarks to Mary and his emotional exchange with Yosef in the Sanhedrin, as well as in private spaces, such as Jesus' moments with John and Judas, Peter's moment with Judas. I might also mention that the final aside that Jesus made to Judas during the Last Supper was also quite strong. In terms of performances, the interactions that took place between Sean Sharma, Shmuel, and Ivan Jasso, Yosef, were full of passion and feeling. Luke Demien does an excellent job of expressing the hardship that Judas is going through. Richard Fancy, on the other hand, continues to offer a Caiaphas that is powerful and engaging. The manner in which the curse of the fig tree is handled is something that I find to be rather enjoyable. As a result of the fact that this occurrence is perplexing and a little unsettling for a number of readers, I appreciate how the performance makes use of the event to continue to emphasize the disciples' sense of perplexity and anxiety at Jesus' actions. Villains. I think some of the things that the show has done with Shmuel and his ongoing descent are incredibly effective. Caiaphas' scorn for the Pharisees, as well as the way in which the Pharisees prod and use his vulnerabilities, is another aspect of the story that I find delightful. Episode 4 suffers from a primary deficiency. The nature of the back and forth between Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin is a little difficult to follow, which contributes to the confusion that exists in international politics. I get that Caiaphas does not want to have to debate about Jesus, and that he just wants to arrest him, but I do not fully comprehend the reason why the Pharisees are so determined to exclude him from taking part in their discussions. Again, I have a feeling that casual viewers will have an even harder time following and investing in the small variations in the political perspectives of the various factions, especially considering that we haven't spent a lot of time with them up until this point in The Chosen. The Chosen Season 5, Episode 4, Key Themes and Reflections. Once more, I will be updating this post at a later time with my comments on the primary themes that were discussed in the episode. I'll probably mention a few of them here. The merciful deliverance of God and the appropriate thanksgiving. The prayers of Dinu, which are heard both in the beginning of the story and at its conclusion, serve to emphasize the immense grace that Jesus demonstrates in the process of delivering his people. Not only does Jesus save his people from their oppressors, the Egyptians and the false gods, Mary's demons, the sickness of Tamar's friend, he calls them into a new identity and purpose, giving Israel the Torah, calling Mary by name, calling Peter, giving Joanna purpose, and sustains them along the way, providing wealth, supplying the needs of Israel in the desert, raising Lazarus, and defending Mary's honor. When taken as a whole, these acts of deliverance greatly transcend anything that anybody could believe they are owed or entitled to. They demonstrate grace. Individually, every one of these acts of deliverance would have been enough. The appropriate way to respond to this grace is not merely to express thanks, but also to make a commitment to keeping the commandments of God, particularly the new commandment, which states, "Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another." John 13, verse 34, English Standard Version. When Judas goes out to betray Jesus, the disciples make the incorrect assumption that he is going to participate in almsgiving as a way of expressing his thankfulness to God for his wonderful deliverance. Judas, on the other hand, is truly betraying his master, which is the most extreme kind of ingratitude. It is possible that Judas's lack of thankfulness stems from the fact that he makes no attempt to comprehend grace. Judas has been under the impression from the very beginning that Jesus chose him because he has something to offer Jesus, rather than because Jesus has something to offer him. In spite of the fact that he argues that he would be nothing if he were unable to make any contributions, the entire point of the account of the Exodus is that God delivered Israel when it was considered nothing by the rest of the world and made it into his beloved property. Israel did not transform itself into something in order for God to deliver it. Rather, God delivered his people and then provided them with a new identity and purpose, the Torah, in order to express their thanks. Judas, unfortunately, fails to recognize this point, and as a result, he decides to follow his own ideas instead. While Jesus and John are talking about the stories of Jephthah and Agamemnon, they also bring up the concepts of deliverance, grace, and thanks. Jephthah and Agamemnon both seek divine favor through the offering of sacrifices. However, the difficulty is that the sacrifices that they offer are not of the kind that God asks for or desires. It would have been possible for Jephthah to have faith in God's ability to graciously deliver Israel, and then to respond with grateful obedience. Instead, he does the same thing that Judas did and relies on his own views. As John contemplates the fact that, just as Jephthah's disobedience resulted in the death of his daughter, the disobedience of the people of God will soon result in the death of Jesus. He wonders how they will be able to forgive themselves or find peace. Consequently, Jesus is need to urge him to look to the wonderful deliverance that God has provided. It is not necessary for John to take any action in order to find peace or forgive himself. Rather, he must accept the forgiveness, peace, and liberation that Jesus provides. Exactly to whom do you belong? In the midst of their acrimonious conversation, Jesus cautions Judas that he will soon be required to make a decision regarding who he is a part of. That being said, by the time they have this chat, we already know the answer to the question. During the frigid open of the Last Supper, shortly before Judas goes to betray him, Jesus tells him with a sense of regret that he has you now. The he in this context refers to Satan, not God. John 13, verse 27. According to John 8, verse 44, those who choose to engage in deception and murder do so with the intention of establishing themselves as children of the devil. Those who are Jesus' little children, on the other hand, demonstrate this by adopting the kind of love that Jesus exemplified, which is love that is self-sacrificing and self-giving. John 13, verses 33 and 34. Within the context of the confrontation that takes place between Shmuel, Mary, and Yosef, the concept of belonging is also brought up prominently. Mary is described by Shmuel as the woman who may be found in the red quarter and who is possessed by 7 devils. Mary pushes back and corrects the record by declaring that she is possessed by the God of the universe and that she originates from Magdala by the sea. This is said in response to the previous statement, a declaration that she belonged to him and his ways, not the ways of Satan and this world, was made by Jesus when he called her by her name, Mary. Despite the fact that Shmuel is willing to seek murder at the Sanhedrin, even in the name of Torah, it is ironic because this behavior shows that the group to which he belongs is not God. Will you continue to have faith? When Judas lays out his plan for what Jesus ought to accomplish, Jesus responds with a question that is quite challenging. If I don't do whatever big thing you imagine I ought to do, will you still believe in me? An essential component of faith, as Peter explains to Judas, is having faith that Jesus is aware of what he is doing. Real belief is the readiness to follow Jesus wherever he goes, even when he takes us in a way that does not appear to be good in our eyes. When we become overly full of our notions about what Jesus ought to do, then we are unable to have true belief. This is similar to what happened to Judas. The act of betrayal committed by Judas in the film, The Chosen, appears to be an attempt to coerce Jesus into performing the action that Judas believes he ought to perform. The fact that Jesus did not react in the manner that Shmuel believed he ought to have was another factor that appears to have contributed to Shmuel's ultimate decision to renounce his belief. What were your thoughts on the 4th episode of the 5th season of The Chosen? Thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts, questions, and hypotheses in the comment section below. Several debates have been raised by the 5th episode of the 2nd season of The Chosen. In addition to this, it is a complicated episode that explores a number of different storylines and character arcs that were established earlier in the 2nd season. A final meeting takes place between Jesus and John the Baptist before John departs to confront Herod Antipas. During this meeting, Jesus expresses his regret at the prospect of John being arrested and put to death. As Mary Magdalene teaches Rama Hebrew, she has a difficult time learning how to read Hebrew. In this story, Mary Magdalene faces her demons from the past, both in the physical sense and in the metaphorical sense. Simon the Zealot goes in quest of Jesus, in which he is presented to the disciples and makes a commitment to remain faithful to them. During the course of his investigation into Simon the Zealot, Atticus Emilius comes to the realization that followers of Jesus believe that he is the Messiah. Matthew continues to struggle to fit in with the other disciples of Jesus, and he frequently finds himself in dispute with Thomas at this time. In order to bring charges against Jesus, Shmuel and his companion Yanni are attempting to devise a strategy that will convince the Sanhedrin to do so. This is the time when Jesus leaves to compose the Sermon on the Mount. You are correct in thinking that this is a lot. In fact, it is. As a result of the fact that The Chosen Season 2 Episode 5 covers a lot of material in an effort to provide the season as a whole with greater direction and drive, it is essential to be judicious while discussing it with young people. Since I haven't given the adaptation of his character a great deal of attention in these posts, we will be concentrating mostly on John the Baptist. However, we will also quickly discuss the topic of confronting demons, which is another concept that plays a significant role in the episode. Question and answer session for the 5th episode of Season 2 of The Chosen, Crazy John the Baptist. First, I would like to determine what your younger generation already knows about John by asking them the following questions. Do you know who John the Baptist was? What information about him can we glean from the New Testament? The fact that John the Baptist baptized Jesus and that he prepared for Jesus in some way is something that a lot of young people are aware of. There's a possibility that they recall hearing about his peculiar diet and his peculiar clothes. When students learn about John's dispute with Herod Antipas, his arrest, and his eventual demise, they will have a lower level of awareness. I believe that this episode of The Chosen anticipates that we will come into it with an understanding of what is going to happen next, despite the fact that these particulars could be called spoilers in a sense. Without the knowledge of John's fate, the encounter between Jesus and John really feels a little bit random and out of place. Additionally, the powerful dramatic irony that The Chosen is aiming for will be missed. This is not a twist that The Chosen is attempting to conceal. Rather, it is a doom that the program foreshadows and moves toward with a melancholy and mournful demeanor. When this is taken into consideration, I would recommend that the following text be read by your young people as an introduction to John the Baptist. It was during those times that John the Baptist traveled through the wilderness of Judea and preached, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." This is the same individual that the prophet Isaiah referred to when he said, "The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." John wore a garment made of camel's hair and a leather belt around his waist, and his food consisted of locusts and wild honey. At that time, Jerusalem and all of Judea, as well as the region surrounding the Jordan, were making their way to him, and they confessed their sins to him while being baptized in the Jordan River. As soon as he noticed that a significant number of Sadducees and Pharisees were going to his baptism, he addressed them by saying, "You brood of vipers! You were warned to run away from the wrath that was going to arrive. Accumulate fruit that is consistent with repentance. And do not think that you can say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our father,' because I tell you that God is able to bring up children for Abraham from these stones. Even now, the axe is being used to cut down the trees at their roots. As a result, every tree that does not produce fruit that is of a satisfactory quality is felled and thrown into the fire. You are being baptized with water for the purpose of repentance. Nevertheless, the one who is coming after me is more powerful than I am, and I am not worthy of carrying his sandals. Baptism with the Holy Spirit and fire will be performed on you by him." After that, Jesus traveled from Galilee to John in order to be baptized by him. His winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear his threshing floor and bring his wheat into the barn. However, he will burn the chaff with fire that cannot be extinguished. In order to prevent him from doing so, John would have asked him, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" However, Jesus responded to him by saying, "Let it be so now, for consequently it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness." At that moment, he gave his consent, and as soon as Jesus was baptized, he immediately ascended from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened to him. He witnessed the Spirit of God descending like a dove and coming to rest on him. And behold, a voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." Matthew 3 verses 1 to 17 with the English Standard Version. After Jesus had finished educating his 12 disciples, he went on to teach and preach in their several cities. He eventually returned to his hometown. Now, when John was incarcerated and heard about the deeds that Christ had performed, he sent word to him through his disciples and asked him, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?" And Jesus responded to them by saying, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight and the lame walk. Lepers are cleansed and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have those who preach the good news preached to them. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me." As they were leaving, Jesus began to talk to the multitudes about John. He said, "What was it that you went out into the wilderness to see? Does the wind cause a reed to shake? Afterwards, what did you go out to see then? Does he wear clothing that is comfortable? Behold, people who dress in comfortable attire are found in the homes of kings. Afterwards, what did you go out to see then? Is it a prophet? In addition to being a prophet, I can confirm this for you. This is the individual concerning whom it is said, 'Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you.' In all honesty, I am telling you that among people who are born of women, there has never been a person who has been more influential than John the Baptist. On the other hand, the person who is subordinate to him in the kingdom of heaven is superior to him. There has been violence against the kingdom of heaven from the time of John the Baptist until the present day, and those who are violent have taken it by force. He is Elijah who is to come, as all the prophets and the law prophesied up until John. And if you are willing to accept it, he is the one who is scheduled to come. Those who are able to hear should be allowed to do so. The question is, to what generation shall I compare this one? It is comparable to children sitting in the marketplaces and calling out to their playmates, 'We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not mourn.' For John came without eating or drinking, and they say, 'He has a demon.' On the other hand, the Son of Man came with eating and drinking, and they say, 'Look at him, an alcoholic and a glutton, a companion of those who collect taxes and those who commit sins.'" Matthew 11 verses 1 to 19 in the English Standard Version. "Yet wisdom is justified by her deeds." At that time, Herod the Tetrarch became aware of the popularity that Jesus had gained, and he explained to his men that this individual was John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people because they held him to be a prophet. However, when Herod's birthday arrived, the daughter of Herodias danced in front of the guests, which thrilled Herod to such an extent that he made a solemn vow to grant her any request that she may make. The king was regretful, but because of his oaths and his guests, he demanded that the head of John the Baptist be handed to her. She said this after being prompted by her mother. "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter," she said. He sent John to the prison and had him beheaded there. The girl was given John's head on a plate, and she then delivered it to her mother. He had John decapitated. In addition, his disciples came and buried the body, after which they proceeded and informed Jesus about what had happened. As soon as Jesus became aware of this, he departed from that location on a boat and traveled to a barren location by himself. Extract from Matthew 14:1-13a. It is important that you make it very obvious to your pupils, prior to reading these passages, that it is impossible for you to explain and discuss everything that is included within them. You may bring up the fact that a significant number of these occurrences will almost certainly be incorporated into the Chosen itself sooner or later. In the meanwhile, you should instruct them to concentrate on the identity of John the Baptist and the relationship that he had with Jesus. When you have finished reading, get in touch with them and ask them, what is it that you would like to know? Why was it so difficult to comprehend? What is the identity of John the Baptist according to these passages? Is he described in any way? What do you think his role was? What was the nature of the relationship that existed between Peter the Baptist and Jesus? In what way did they perceive one another? You might want to break things down even farther than you already have. In particular, the baptism of John and the significance of that event can be perplexing to your younger generation, and this might be especially the case depending on the practices and beliefs that your church has around baptism. It is important to keep in mind, however, that the purpose of this period is only to stimulate the thoughts of your students. It is a good idea to frequently review some relevant information from past episodes of The Chosen, especially considering that there is not a regular Previously on The Chosen segment. This is because the storyline of The Chosen has become more complicated at the beginning of the second season. There are a few questions that you might wish to go over again. It is not necessary to take too much time. This is simply a brief review. What happened in the most recent episode? In the first season, what was it that Jesus rescued Mary from? In addition to the demons that she possessed, do we have any information concerning Mary's life before she came into contact with Jesus? Looking for the little phrase, the red quarter, there are three people who do not belong to the group: Matthew, Rama, and Mary Magdalene. Is there any information that they do not possess that the others do? What was it that they decided to begin doing in the second episode of the second season of The Chosen? Watching the fifth episode of the second season of The Chosen. Despite the fact that The Chosen Season 2 Episode 5 was broadcast live on YouTube and Facebook, new episodes are now only allowed to remain online for a period of 24 hours before being automatically removed. You will need to download the Chosen app, available on Google Play and Apple App Store, in order to watch this season with your group. I would occasionally give comments through the chat while I was viewing the fifth episode of the second season of The Chosen, but I tried to avoid doing too much teaching about the show. It is my hope that young people will take pleasure in it and not only view The Chosen as an elaborate instance of preaching. The most of the time, I simply define who the characters are, and then every once in a while, I provide a brief explanation of a reference or allusion that is unclear to my younger self. Cousin John, sometimes known as the Baptist, is the topic of discussion for the fifth episode of The Chosen Season 2. Your youth group should begin by asking the following questions. What was it about this episode that stood out to you the most? Did you find any of the scenes to be particularly intriguing or emotionally moving? Can you tell me if you have any inquiries regarding what took place? What are some of the ways in which you would characterize John the Baptist in the adaptation that is found in The Chosen? Are you able to reconcile it with the image you had of him? What struck you as particularly interesting about the relationship that existed between Jesus and John the Baptist? Were you taken aback by the fact that John the Baptist and Jesus had different points of view towards each other? Or what was it that they couldn't agree on? What aspects of their respective missions were reflected in their disagreement? What were some of the things that you observed in the manner in which John and Jesus resolved their differences via conversation and came to an understanding of one another? Or why does Jesus feel sad at the end of the day? When John the Baptist faces Herod Antipas, Jesus encourages him to pay attention to the voice of God. This occurs at the very conclusion of the story. Why is it so crucial to continue to listen to the voice of God while one is confronting the evil that is committed by others? Jesus acknowledges that John the Baptist is carrying out his duties in the appropriate manner. Nevertheless, on the other hand, Jesus expresses his sorrow over the suffering that John would endure. Do you remember a time when you were forced to endure pain in order to fulfill the mission that God had given you? Are you of the opinion that Jesus felt saddened by the suffering that you endured? P2. Confronting Demons discussion questions with regard to the 5th episode of The Chosen Season 2. Mention the following to your students as a transitional point. The boldness with which John the Baptist fought corrupt human authorities, such as Herod Antipas, while delivering the word of God, earned him a reputation for his bravery. In the same way that John is preparing to confront Herod in a forceful manner, a number of other characters are also about to confront a demonic entity that calls itself Belial. In particular, we see Belial having a confrontation with Mary, during which he refers to her as Lilith, which was the name she used to go by while she was possessed. This occurs at the very beginning of the 1st season of The Chosen. Throughout the course of the episode, Mary appears to be experiencing a recurrence of her prior trauma as a result of her interaction with Roman soldiers. Note, in episode 1, it is alluded to that she was a victim of sexual assault at the hands of a Roman soldier. As the episode draws to a close, she returns to the life she experienced before. We frequently remark that a person is confronting their demons when they are dealing with emotional pain or misdeeds from their past. The Chosen may be trying to get us to recognize a connection between the fact that Mary is meeting a literal demon that is tied to her past and the fact that she is also confronting the pain that she has experienced. Now, inquire of your younger generation. If you, like Mary, have ever had the experience of having a challenging event in the past that you did not want to recall, what was that feeling like? When Mary makes an effort to fight the demon on her own, he comes dangerously close to defeating her. However, when Jesus arrives, he is successfully vanquished. What are the reasons that it is essential for us to call Jesus to be with us when we confront our history or the challenges that lie deep inside us? Similar to Episode 5, The Chosen Season 2 Episode 6 is juggling multiple narratives, including the following. While Matthew and Simon Peter are on the hunt for Mary Magdalene, they play the role of a buddy cop. After Mary Magdalene has fallen off the wagon and relapsed into a life of drinking and gambling, Jesus is able to forgive her and restore her to her former state of being. Rama learns from Mary, the mother of Jesus, what it means to put one's faith in God while one is in a less fortunate position. Thomas is concerned that there would be no more food available at the camp. John and James, who are the sons of Zebedee, take a moment to contemplate the fact that there is still a great deal that they do not comprehend regarding the act of following Jesus. The disciples express their sorrow over the news of John the Baptizer's arrest and briefly consider the possibility of recruiting zealots to assist in rescuing him. Shmuel and Yanni make a fruitless attempt to have Jesus tried for heresy. Jesus sends the disciples to a synagogue in the countryside, where he cures a man on the Sabbath, allows the disciples to eat grain from the field, and as a result, the leaders of the synagogue reprimand him. Since I'm being really honest, Episode 6 of The Chosen Season 2 felt unfocused, and numerous significant scenes felt like they were hurried. This was due to the fact that so many different narrative threads were all being thrown together at the same time. An episode about Mary and Simon and Matthew, with a lot more tension built up between Simon and Matthew, and also a slower ending to Mary's battle. And an episode about the disciples running out of food and all of the Sabbath issues would have been ideal. Both of these episodes would have been a part of the series. Regrettably, I am concerned that a significant number of the conflicts that have arisen throughout this season, particularly those that involve Shmuel, John the Baptist, and Atticus were brought far too late in the game. As a consequence, there is currently insufficient space for everything to take place at the appropriate pace. In any case, enough criticizing. In spite of the fact that Episode 6 of The Chosen season, May 2nd, have certain shortcomings, there is still a great deal for your youth group to work with and take into consideration. In addition, despite the fact that Episode 6 seems to be a little disorganized, I believe that there are underlying themes that connect the majority of the episodes. During the first half of Episode 6, the drama that surrounds Mary's relapse and the efforts that Matthew and Simon make to locate her and bring her back to Jesus becomes the primary emphasis. The arguments regarding the Sabbath that take place between Jesus and the leaders of a local synagogue are the culmination of the second half of episode number 6. As my title suggests, the idea of God's preference for mercy above human righteousness is what connects these seemingly unrelated storylines together. This preference is exhibited by careful regard to ritualistic regulations. As part of this session, your young people will be investigating this topic. Intro questions for the 6th episode of the 2nd season of The Chosen: mercy and not sacrifice. The idea of the Sabbath or Shabbat was presented in the guide that I wrote about the 2nd episode of the 1st season of The Chosen. If you and your group have not yet gone through that lesson, you might want to go back over it and possibly incorporate some of the aspects that you learned, for example, the video that was used in Bible study to explain the Sabbath. For the remainder of this guide, we will continue to investigate the Sabbath, but only inasmuch as it is connected to the biblical concept of mercy. In order to get things started, have the young people in your group read the following verse from Isaiah. Cry out loud. Do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their transgression, and to the house of Jacob their sins, the prophet said. Despite this, they seek me out on a regular basis and take great pleasure in learning my ways, as if they were a people that acted in a righteous manner and did not abandon the judgment of their God. They beg me for just judgments. They take great pleasure in drawing near to God. Why have we been fasting and you are not able to see it? What is the reason that we have humbled ourselves and you have failed to acknowledge it? Behold, on the day of your fast, you have a desire to satisfy your own desires while you mistreat all of your employees. Behold, the sole purpose of your fast is to engage in quarrels, fights, and to strike with a cruel fist. Attempting to fast like you are doing today will not result in your voice being heard on a higher level. Do you consider the fast that I have chosen to be a day for a person to humble themselves? Is it to show him respect by lowering his head like a reed and placing sackcloth and ashes beneath him? A fast and a day that is pleasing to the Lord is what you intend to name this. Do you not believe that this is the fast that I have chosen, to break every yoke, to release those who are oppressed, to undo the straps of the yoke, and to loosen the shackles of wickedness? Does it not mean to give your bread to those who are hungry and to invite the homeless and the destitute into your home? Does it mean that when you see someone who is naked, you should cover him and not hide yourself from your own flesh? Then shall your light break forth like the morning, and your healing shall spring up soon. Your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry, and he will say, Here I am. If you remove the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger, and the speaking of wickedness, if you pour yourself out for those who are hungry and satisfy the desire of those who are afflicted, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your gloom will be as bright as the noonday. And the Lord will always guide you, and he will fulfill your desires in scorching regions, and he will strengthen your bones. And you will be like a garden that is watered, like a well of water whose waters never run dry. And your ancient ruins will be rebuilt. You will raise up the foundations of many generations. You will be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to dwell in. And you will build up the foundations of many generations. If you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going your own ways, or given the circumstance that we find ourselves in today, to whom do you believe God? is calling you to show mercy on this particularly day? There's a great deal there. And despite the fact that I had some issues with the show as a whole, I felt the sequence with Jesus and Mary was really well done. And I hope that it will have a significant impact on some of your younger viewers. Pray that God would use this opportunity to bless them.